Hello, everyone. My name is Jin, and I am currently a fellow at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, focusing on integration of engineering, design, business, and neuroscience. And today I will be talking to you about Design Methodology 101. And now I am going to share my screen so you can see it. So with Design Methodology 101, why is this important? Well, I would like to start with this comic here that some of you may already be familiar with. This is something that's very similar to how a lot of projects are currently run. In the bottom right corner is what the customer actually really needs. And then you can see that throughout the comic, starting from the first slide, you can see that the customer, first of all, communicates it in a way that is, I guess, different from the actual needs. And then the person listening to it is also interpreting it differently from how the customer explains it, and then so on and so forth. And what you get in the end is a picture of a product or a service that's very, very different from what the customer actually needs. And you spend all that time, all that resources, money, etc., and you end up with something that has a mismatch with the customer. So how do we solve this problem? Well, I would like to take you through the 5-phase design thinking model that the Stanford Design School provides. And just to highlight, the word design thinking is actually a term that a lot of us don't like, but it's something that the term is very popular. What we would like to usually call this instead is either human-centered design or something of that sort. So just wanted to stress on that. So with this model, we have 5 different phases. The first phase is empathize. You really want to get into the user's shoes and understand what the user really, really needs. And then once you understand the user's needs, you would then go and define the problem, and then you would ideate. And this is a phase what most people will call brainstorming. And I would like to say that there's a lot more involved than just brainstorming. And I'll get into more details later on this. And then once you have that, you would then prototype your ideas and then test them with your users. And then you would reiterate the process. I would like to point out that the reason why this is a honeycomb shape instead of a sequential process is because a lot of these steps can actually go on either in parallel, or you can have repetitions go on. So it's not really a sequential thing. So do keep that in mind. So now to go through the 5 phases in more details, the first one is to empathize. And as you can see illustrated in this picture, this is the customer, and then this is you. And as you start to really interact with the customer, you become more and more like the customer. You really understand the needs of the customer, and that's what we really want. So what does that really look like? Well, there are 4 different parts that I want to highlight. First one is something called in-person interview. So with this one, what you really want is to sit down with individuals one-on-one and really have in-depth conversations with them. These are usually half an hour to an hour interviews. And here we're not looking for quantity, but rather quality. And you really want to really listen to the user describe the problem for you. And the reason why you want to do one-on-one is because you really don't want a group of users all talking to you at the same time, because then you get 2 different scenarios. One is there's group thinking happening, meaning there are people that will dominate the conversation, and then there are people that would just go along with whoever is talking instead of thinking for themselves. The second thing is that a lot of people who are more shy and reserved will not get a chance to talk as much, and you miss out on valuable information that way. So do one-on-one interviews as much as possible, and do them in person as much as possible, because what you have in a lot of cases are things like body language and a lot of cues that are in the room with the person that you really don't get to see if you're just doing a phone call or Skype or worse yet, email. So a lot of you may be wondering, well, what if my user base is somewhere else in the world? What if they're in Brazil and I am in Canada? What do I do in that case? Well, I would say fly over, get as close to your users as possible. So you really want to do one-on-one in-person interviews as much as possible. The second thing I want to point out is observational research is very, very important. So with this, you're really looking at, if I were to go back to a comic here, what the user really needs is a tire swing in this case. But the user, due to whatever reason, described it in such a way that it gave the impression that it's actually a step swing or whatever this is instead. And then the person listening to it may have understood it to be, I don't know, a swing of some sort hanging from a tree. So you really get a miscommunication between the last step and here. And that's what you really want to avoid. So when you do observational research, you really want the user to really show you the problem in person, take you through it. And there's also something called latent needs, which is a lot of times what's really obvious to the user may not be obvious to you. So the user may not even bother to explain it because they may think that's very intuitive, or it could be a need that they're very embarrassed to really talk about. That through observational research, you really get to see yourself. For example, there's something very common called ethnographic research, where you do research across cultures, and what's really, really obvious to someone else because of their culture may not be obvious to you because you come from a different culture. So through observational research and looking at latent needs, you really get to pick up additional cues that you don't get to see by just doing a 1-hour chat with a person. The third thing I want to point out is that it's really important to also shadow the person, do a day in the life of sort of thing. And what I mean by that is go beyond the scope of the problem. For example, let's just say you're targeting the problem of, I don't know, how users use staplers in the office setting. And whether that hurts their wrist if they staple papers, I don't know, 10 times per day. Now you may think, okay, I just have to observe the user using the stapler in the office, and then after that, I'm done. But what you really want to do is go beyond that. Follow the user home, see what their family life is like, see what they do outside of work, see who their friends are, what their hobbies and interests are. And many of you may be familiar with the concept of a persona. And in this case, you know, it's very similar, where you really want to get to know the overall user in the day of life of, not just the problem itself, because that gives you an overall picture. Maybe the user also do a lot of heavy lifting at home, and that may affect the way they use staplers. Maybe their arms hurt from carrying boxes at home. Maybe the person just moved, I don't know, but that may affect how they use that stapler. So really get into the day in the life of picture outside of the context of just your product or service. The first thing is you really want to get to know the existing solutions, and that falls into 2 camps. It could be a solution that the user has come up with, him or herself. It could be an improv sort of solution. So, you know, in the case of a stapler, maybe the user is using their entire body, or I don't know, something else to really try and get that stapler to work. Or it could be an existing solution that already exists, and that could be a product or service that's your competitor that already exists. So it really gives you a chance to look at what solutions are already out there, how well they perform, and if these solutions already perform very, very well, it saves you the trouble of inventing something new and instead pivot to something else that the user may need. So these are the 4 different aspects of empathy that you really want to do. And again, document everything. And the reason why you want to do so is twofold. One is there are certain patterns that you may not realize until you've interviewed enough users. So let's say you interview 100 people, and by the end of the 100 users, you get to see, oh, okay, so this could be a pattern that you're observing. But by then, your memory for what the first user did could be very, very faint by then. But if you've got videos or audio recordings or photos as evidence, you can then go back and look at them and say, this is what the first user did and whether that actually fits the patterns. The second thing is a lot of times you're working in teams, and you may also have new people joining the team later on, and your team members may not be going with you to these interviews. So a lot of times they may pick up additional cues from your recordings that you may not have picked up on the spot. And also a picture is worth 1,000 words, let alone a video. So instead of you describing these things, if your team members can get to see these on their own by using videos and all that, then it's much, much better, much, much easier than you describing things. So I really want you guys to start documenting things, of course, with the user's permission. And like I said earlier, avoid focus groups. And part of the reason why is because you really don't want to do group thinking. And also minimize the number of surveys you do, at least for the first 100 or so interviews, because what you really want in the beginning is quality rather than quantity. And once you have enough user interviews to predict a certain pattern or behavior, then you can do surveys, which allows you to get into bigger quantities, such as 1,000 users, 5,000 users, etc., to really predict some of the trends and patterns. So once you've done all these things, the next stage is to actually define the problem. And I would like to break this into 3 parts. And some of you, if you've already done some of the other bootcamp courses, would know that would be very familiar with the first and the third. So for market segmentation, you really want to look at, are there enough patterns within your user base to start breaking them apart into segments? So for example, if I'm targeting users who are blind, I may say people who were born blind versus people who became blind later on in life are 2 different groups of users with different behavior patterns. May want to segregate the 2. You may segregate them based on age, gender, location, geographically, ethnic backgrounds, upbringings, and a variety of other factors. And this will really allow you to zone in on individual patterns and behaviors and do more analysis on these. And the second one is something called a user needs list. I believe Erdine has touched upon this in the past with some of the other lectures. With this, you really want to look at what the user needs, and this should have been communicated to you through phase 1. If not, do go back regularly and re-interview your users or interview more people as much as possible to find out what your users actually need and generate a list of that. So for example, cost may be a factor, ease of use may be a factor. There are a variety of things that you would want to look at. And once you have that user needs list, rank your user needs and start focusing on those that are higher up in the list. And obviously for personas, you really want to look at your market segments, and within the segments, what are some of the specific types of users that you want to start mapping out. And again, what I mentioned before about the day in the life of sort of user interview really helps you to fill in some of the details in these parts so that you really get to know who your users are. And once you really understand your user and their problem, then you would start the ideate phase. And for this phase, there are 3 different parts I would like to focus on. The first one is something called mood boards, and this is what you want your final product to look like or feel like. And this is something where you really want to trigger emotions. So for example, in this picture, you're looking at a product or service that gives you a lot of wintry, fun feelings. And again, your product could be, oh, I don't know, a computer mouse. It may not be even related to a ski resort or winter or fun, but you really want your product to generate certain feelings, so you create mood boards. And a lot of times what I would like to do is go on sites such as Pinterest to pull up these kinds of images to sort of generate that feeling of what you want your final product to look like. And again, communicate this feeling to your entire team, and the mood board is a very, very effective way to help everyone get on the same page in terms of how you want your product to feel like. And then the next stage you want is the actual brainstorming stage. Now you may do this using a whiteboard, you may do it using post-it notes, but I would also want to highlight that it's important to also do sketches. Now your sketches may not look as pretty as these, don't worry, these were done by professional artists, but I want you guys to start to actually sketch out what you want your final product to look like, because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So a lot of times once you start to communicate your ideas over to your team, they may interpret it a slightly different way, but once you start sketching them out, you really get to allow everyone to align onto the same page. So start sketching these out and then number your sketches. So that could be your first idea, your second idea, your third idea, fourth idea, etc. So number them. And once you number them, the next step is what I would call a DFM rating process. And that is when you rank your ideas that you've numbered in the previous slide based on these rankings. So remember the user needs list I talked about before? Give each a score. So let's say your idea 1 could meet your top user needs, I don't know, 4 out of 5 as a rating. And then also do a rating based on these 3 factors. So how feasible or viable is your product? Will people actually buy it? So this is the business part. How well would it function? Is it more of something that currently doesn't exist and you really need to work out the engineering part to see if it actually could function? In which case, is it more science fiction rather than science at this stage? Or is it something very, very feasible in terms of functionality? So give that a rating. And then how desirable is your product? As you can see in the early days, Apple versus Microsoft, you can see clearly that in terms of desirability, in terms of design, Apple won by a landslide, and that's why it became so popular. So give it a rating in terms of desirability as well. And once you have all these ratings, you have multiple ways of deciding how to move forward. You can either do an average of these scores, or you can focus on one specific aspect. For example, maybe functionality is very important. So you may want to have something with very high functionality score, and then maybe moderately high scores in the other areas. But whatever it is that you choose to do decide to, work on certain ideas or select certain ideas based on these kinds of ratings. And then once you have your top ideas based on your ratings, the next stage is prototyping. And for prototyping, there are 2 different types. If you're doing something that's physical, so it could be a hardware product, it could be something that doesn't involve electronics altogether, I would do either form factors or semi-functional modules. So for form factors, here's something from Dyson, which is a vacuum cleaner company. So what they did for their prototypes is they actually created look-alike models out of cardboard and plastic. Now you can use other materials such as clay, you can use 3D printing, you can use foam, you can use a variety of different materials. And what you want to do here is create look-alike models. This will help you to figure out where different components will go and whether there are certain conflicts in the components. It also helps to create life-size models so that your users can go back and test them out to see how comfortable these are, etc. And this really helps to bring your actual prototype to life so that it's not just the idea, and your users can really give you feedbacks at this stage. You can also do semi-functional models. So for this example, this is coming from Google Glass. What they have is things that are very big and clunky in the beginning that may be very uncomfortable. So they're not looking at comfort in this case, the way that they're looking at it here. But rather they're looking at, if I were to implement these functionalities, would users like them? And you can have semi-functional modules in parallel, and then you can get the users to test them. And again, it's a reiteration process, so you really want your users to test these in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, all the way to the final version, so that your users are really involved in the process throughout the whole design phase. That way, they're also more likely to recommend this to their networks because it's a product that they have been heavily involved in, and that they know for sure that it either really meets their needs, or they understand the restrictions for why it doesn't. So they're much more likely to recommend it to other people as well. So on the software side, if you're doing, say, app or website or some kind of software, there are 3 different phases that you want to go through for prototyping at this point. The first phase is wireframes. And this is when you get out your pen and paper. It could also be done on the computer, but you really get to lay out all your different screens, what they look like, and which ones advance to other screens. And you really get to think about the overall roadmap of it. And once you've done that, you would then go on to the second phase, which is called mockups. And this is where you focus on the UI part of the design. So for design, a lot of times you will hear words like UI, UX. UI is the user interface. This is the aesthetic appeal of it. And UX is the user interface, user experience, where you really want to work on things like, are the buttons confusing to the users? Are they intuitive? So for the UI phase here, you're really looking at whether users want this style, certain fonts on the page, and the location of buttons and things like that. So you really want to lay things out and get the users to give you feedbacks as to whether this makes any sense. So this is more aesthetics. And then the next phase is the actual prototype. And this is where you focus on the UX or user experience. And there are software such as InVision or Sketch. Sketch is for Mac only, InVision is for both platforms, and then there are other software out there that can help you to really turn your mockups from this phase into semi-functional interactive pages. And in this case, what you're doing is creating hot links from the mockups. So for example, if I click on the search button here, it may lead to this next screen. And obviously, they're not fully functional. So, every time I click on this button, it will always get to this cane here. But what the user gets a sense of is how to navigate the website and how to say, if there's a buy now button, it will actually lead to this page, for example, to actually look at what that navigation looks like and whether that process is confusing or if it's very intuitive to the user, and they can give you additional feedbacks that way. So once you've gone through all that prototyping, you really want to test with your users. And I want to break this section into 3 parts. The first one is called A/B testing. And this is when you have a group of beta testers and you want to split them apart into different sub-users. So in this case, what I want to do is, for example, you may have created, say, 3 different versions of your website. So you would split your beta users into 3 different types. And when you do so, you will expose each version of your website to a different type of user. And again, this could also apply to physical products. It's just easier to illustrate through software. So you would expose your users each to one type of product or service, and then see what the responses are based on that. And then you will pick your best version based on people's responses. It's also good to keep in mind that first-time users and long-term users may behave very, very differently. So first-time users may find a lot of things to be confusing, non-intuitive, and they may give you a lot of immediate feedbacks in that sense. Long-term users are somewhat used to your navigations or your product or service, and even if your product or service is confusing, they're used to it enough to tolerate it, but they may be able to point out additional things that are, I would say, that first-time users may not be able to point out for you. So when you're doing testing and you're looking at how much should you test, what that duration should look like, keep in mind both types of users when you do your testing. And again, in terms of latent needs, like I mentioned earlier, you really want to take a step back, pretend that you're not there, observe from a distance how your user is using that product. Now you could have the user use it in their natural environment and record themselves, or you could have, taking a seat beside them while they're navigating a website, for example, and keeping quiet and seeing how they click on buttons, how long it takes for them to find the homepage or find, I don't know, the search button. And that will give you a good idea for how much you need to change your product or service. So test, 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 and again, document everything for the obvious reasons that I mentioned before. So now that I have gone through the 5 phases, let's go through an actual example. So this is an example not to be taken very seriously. I created this a couple semesters ago, just for fun mostly. So this is an example of how people carry wires. And this could be headphone wires, laptop chargers, or phone chargers kind of wires. And what are some of the needs? So this is actually a slide deck, and I just want to highlight 2 things before I go on to the 5 phases. One is that for slide decks, a lot of times you're pitching to an audience and you're really trying to win them over. And in this case, you really want them to connect with the problem through an emotional means. Meaning that if you start the slide deck with a story and with an actual person, a lot of the times, it really helps the person to connect. So you can say, meet Bob. Bob is a university student who has a lot of work to do, and he really doesn't have time to untangle his headphone wires on a daily basis, kind of thing, and really get the user to really connect with Bob. Now, if you start with statistics like 70 million Americans suffer from this or that, it's a number, and a lot of times it really doesn't communicate the emotional appeal across as much as if you say, meet Bob, and Bob has this personal problem. So do keep that in mind when you do so. And then keep your slides very, very simple. So I may say Bob, over the course of his lifetime, would spend 109,000 minutes untangling wires if he were to go on with his daily life like this. Do you really want Bob to continue like this when he could be doing scientific research, curing cancer instead of untangling wires? Now, I may not write all that in a paragraph. I may just say 109,000 minutes, and that is all you really need. And the user really just wants to, the audience really just wants to hear you talk and not read all that on the slide. So keep your slides very simple, get to the main point. Now, to go into 5 phases. The first phase, like I said before, is empathy. So you want to take a lot of photos, a lot of videos, a lot of interviews. So here, when it comes to the actual presentation, you may not want to show all these videos because if each of them is an hour long, well, people are going to be here for a while. So instead, you can show user photos, for example, collages of how different problems are presented throughout the day, and what are some of the coping mechanisms that users currently have. So show lots of photos, and present some of the existing solutions, and maybe 1 or 2 very, very quick videos for it. And obviously present some of the existing solutions that are out there to see if there's any merit in some of the existing solutions. Maybe all you need to do is modify existing solutions slightly, or if none of them work very well, then you can pivot. But if one of them work really, really well, and you go on and design a solution, maybe you're wasting your time, maybe people already like that solution. So do keep all that in mind. And once you've done all that, then you start to really define the problem. And in this case, you want to start segmenting your markets. And then you can start highlighting market segments that you really want to focus on. And again, you may not want to do more than one, but if there are enough similarities between 2 different groups of people, maybe you want to group them together. And then after that, you start doing the user needs list. And again, here you can see that the product should be tangle-free and not free. That's something I learned during my user interviews, that there's actually a difference between the two. You may want to say, oh, the product keeps the headphones organized, it keeps the wires from being damaged, it's quick to use, etc. So like just a list of needs that the user has. And then you may also want to include actual quotations from users to really help to illustrate the point. And then the right side is importance, which is a ranking of which ones you should focus on. So these are the top user needs, and then the ones on the bottom are less important, or maybe edge case scenarios that only happen a few times that you really don't want to focus on. So then you start to highlight the user needs that you really want to focus on. And then you also get into the personas. And this, if you've done some of the bootcamp courses, this should be very familiar to you. And this is what I meant by mood boards. So in this case, for headphones, you may want to create a pair of headphones. In this case, that's very, very sci-fi looking because I'm targeting a young audience, people in their college age or young professionals. I may want the mood board, I may want the product to be very, very clean looking. So again, none of these have anything to do with headphones, but they all create this feeling of something that's very clean. So I want to communicate that to my team. So I may want to create these kinds of imageries. I may want the headphones to give off a sense of peace or connecting with nature. So again, your product could have multiple mood boards conveying different moods, and you may want to just be able to communicate multiple feelings for a single product. And after that, you want to start sketching things. Again, I'm not a great artist, so here are 30 sketches of different ideas that of how I want the product to look like. And you may notice I have numbered them. I have numbered them because the DFM ratings that are coming up really need these numbers. So the DFM ratings, as you can see, the 1 to 30 sketches, and here are my user needs. It needs to be tangle-free, not free, etc. And how well these sketches or ideas actually meet these individual needs. And on the right side, I'm also looking at the design, how desirable is this product, the functionality, that's the engineering part, and the manufacturing. I can also include how well this kind of product would sell, how much people will actually buy it. And again, this goes back to interviewing your users over and over again and getting their feedbacks throughout all these different phases of your product. So once I have that, I decided to actually average these scores and pick scores that are above 4 to actually do prototypes. And again, you may have a different way of looking at the rankings and deciding on which ones to actually use for your prototypes. So here I have used a variety of materials as prototypes, And what you really want your users to do at this stage is to actually test out these prototypes, see how well they actually work, and give you feedbacks. These look like dentures, but they're actually prototypes. And once you've done enough, again, I mean, this was just a idea for practice, so this obviously didn't go into manufacturing, but if you were to do so, you would actually manufacture this and then actually create a final product based on your user feedbacks. And again, test, and get feedbacks from your users as much as possible. All right, so that's the conclusion of my presentation. I'm sorry that I have not looked at the Q&A, but I will do so now.
Hey, Jin.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation on design methodology. As designers, it's something that we do every day, we think about every day, but it's not necessarily something that the majority of the viewers and learners out there, that they think about this every day. So if you're watching us for the first time, if you're tuning in for the first time, I really want to give Jin a really good introduction. So Jin was part of the bootcamp, second bootcamp class in 2015. She started as an engineer and then came to the bootcamp and decided, hey, MIT is for her. And now she's in the integrated design management program at MIT. And also you are I believe you're doing a double major, Jin, is that correct?
Yes.
What's your double major in?
It's in mechanical engineering.
Yeah, so all that to say, this issue, Jin, if you can share a little bit more, which comes first? Form versus function, which comes first for you?
That is a very good question. I would like to say that as entrepreneurs, I would like to think that we're very multidisciplinary, meaning that we don't actually favor one versus the other, and we try to integrate them as much as possible. Now, engineers a lot of times really want to focus on the functionality and say, hey, that's more important. Who cares about how well it looks? And then designers say, well, you really want the product to sell. Who cares how well it functions? You can always reiterate using versions 2 or 3 or 4. And that's why Apple products, the first version is always problematic. But I would say that if you can try and integrate the two as much as possible, then you end up with a product that's much, much stronger than just focusing on one versus the other. So I don't like to play favorites. And again, I did come from a design background as well. I've gone through about 5 years of design training, 4 years in graphic design, 2D, 3D animation, film, photography, etc., desktop publishing and all that, and then 1 year in product design. And now with mechanical engineering, it's also very, very similar to product design in some ways. And I have done on the side over a decade of design work. So the design experience is there, but then for engineering, my undergrad was in electrical engineering, and then I did about 8 years of work in telecommunications in engineering before coming back to school and doing more mechanical engineering. So to me, both backgrounds are very, very dear to my heart, and I would like to say that you really can't play favorites both.
Hey, well, that's such a great answer. Some small things. Would you be able to share your slides? A lot of people have been asking if you
yes,
share them.
Absolutely.
Great. And I think I want to bring up a few points. You talked about the latent needs. You talked about ethnographic research, and I think these are such sort of intangible things, but yet I feel like they're really so important as we continue to push and forge ahead in innovation and entrepreneurship. Would you be able to, just kind of tie it back into, again, our audience is all focused a lot on innovation, whether it be corporate or new venture. Can you also share a little bit more about why ethnographic research is so important as part of that process, and perhaps tie that in a little bit more?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, there are a lot of things that are not communicated through words that you can only really get to see once you observe the person actually using the product or service. And a lot of mistakes I see in corporate places is that people who actually design the products or services never actually get to connect with the users. So what you get in the end is a disconnect. You get people who are using the product who never really get to talk to people who actually design them. And so you miss out on this big gap in between. And with latent needs, a lot of times, because, so for example, a lot of what we work with right now are users in countries like India, where I obviously don't have the cultural knowledge or background for, and I get to ask a lot of really stupid questions like, why do you do things this or that way? And a lot of these questions come from actually observing the users, and if the user were to just communicate it to me through words, I would think through my Western mindset that this is the way it should be, and not fully understand that people do things very, very differently, say in India or elsewhere in the world. It may not even be elsewhere in the world, it could even be local, but it could just be a different group of people. It could be elderlies, it could be a different gender, it could be men who have problems that I may not understand. In a lot of cases, you may want to send someone who may not be able to relate to the person fully from your team. So for example, if you're targeting products for men, you may want to send a woman there, because if you send a man to the interview, you know, a lot of things are well understood and they may not communicate these to the woman in the team, but if you send a woman there, they may be able to pick up things that they otherwise would not have by, you know, like just watching the videos or the photos afterwards, because you may not be able to record these things because people think it's obvious. So all these play into this whole picture of just trying to understand the user as much as possible, and look at what gaps are missing, what gaps are there that you may not have thought of before.
Great, and just to make a point, really, to tie it back into the primary market research that we focus significantly on in the innovation frameworks that I taught at MIT. It's not just about listening to what they say, but also watching what they do, and that really ties back into the ethnographic research component. Also, I just want to share, Patricia brought up an interesting point. You know, this whole debate about quantitative and qualitative research. She says it's really nonsense. It's a question on knowledge management. But I want to get into the part on, you know, you talked about recording, and there were a few in our audience here. You know, how do you record? What are the ways that you can gain permission for recording, whether it be audio or video or whatever? How do you do that in a practical way?
So a lot of times I would personally ask my users whether I can record them. And I would tell them up front that these are things that will be shared only exclusively with my team, and they won't be, you know, distributed to the public or anything like that, to reassure them that their privacy is not compromised. And I would do that up front instead of recording secretively, because you really want to establish some sort of trust with the user. Now, in certain scenarios, for example, B2B sort of scenarios, it may not be fully possible because there are certain privacies within companies or certain policies that prevents you from doing so, in which case I would take as much notes as possible. But in cases where you are able to do as much recording as possible, and video, I would say, is the best way, followed by perhaps audio or photos, followed by notes. So I would go in that order.
Absolutely. So do you do interviews like a one-on-one, or do you have a partner in the event that, you can't take recordings? Perhaps one person could be writing or recording, and then the other person could be asking the questions and observing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say bring as many of your team members as possible to the live interview, because you want people to observe things live as much as possible. That's always better than anything second-handed. So if time, space, and policies permit, bring your whole team. If you can't fit them all, fine, bring say 5 people or however many. But you really want to get different perspectives as well, and that will also allow different people to take on different roles, and you can discuss that ahead of time. You can say, you go and take notes, you do all the photographs or like videos or whatever, I will do all the question asking, things like that. And again, it also depends on the comfort level of the person. Some people may not like a whole group of people all asking them questions. They may be more comfortable one-on-one. So do take all these things into consideration as well.
Absolutely. And moving on to the next part, that you kind of focus on the issue of documentation, how it's incredibly important to document the work that you have done, the research you have done. Just a quick comment here to say that it's incredibly important because the people who are reviewing, people in your team, or even when your company is working with strategic partners or collaborators, they would also be asking you for research. And so can you share a little bit more about how you've done that? Very practically, how do you, because there's so much information to record. Do you have a repo of some sorts? How do you order your data and stuff?
I think a lot of that is based on personal preference. There might be teams where 1 or 2 people are just dedicated to this whole process. You may not have that luxury if you're a startup. What a lot of people do a lot of times is just have an archive of recordings that they somehow, you can keep a log of, dates, person, and then maybe a blurb about that interview that can help you to remember it later on, so that you can quickly go back to it and rewatch that interview if needed. But I would not sit through, say, 30 hours of interviews because most of us don't have that kind of time. But give yourself some kind of mechanism to quickly be able to retrieve these things, and especially if you're doing presentations for investors later on and you want to show a quick clip of it, again, ask your users ahead of time whether they would allow you to do so. But when you're doing so, you may be able to remember certain segments from certain interviews that you really want to highlight. Then you can quickly go to that file and pull that up, and then go to a certain segment.
Yeah, thank you. And coming back to the mood boards that you have shared, it really talks about the look and feel. But I also feel like that, and also the drawings, the sketches that you were showing, those really relate back to the high-level product specifications that are part of the innovation frameworks taught here at MIT. How do you I guess today we're talking about design, but really inherent to the innovation process is integrating these design concepts and methodologies into innovation. Do you see them to be one and the same, or does the understanding design more so now help you innovate better?
So design is a very, very broad term. You can have engineering design, you can have aesthetics design, you can have product design, all that. And I really should have specified more in my slides. But when I'm referring to design here, I'm referring to a combination of things. So back to the sketches I was doing, these are brainstorm ideas that really take a lot of different factors into consideration. And if you look at the DFM ratings I showed, these are the different considerations that all factor into the design process. So one brainstorm idea may score very, very high on, say, engineering and very, very low on business, for example, or very high on certain user needs and very low on others. So when I'm referring to design for that, specifically, I'm referring to all the different facets of design. Now for mood boards specifically, that is more of an aesthetic appeal that I'm looking at, the user interface, the look of it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's see, the next part. So then we move on to the whole idea of prototyping. And Vivek's asking, how do I prototype if I don't have enough sketching or prototyping skills? Whether I can build stuff, how can I, continue to improve?
So prototyping, just like anything, comes with practice. Now you can either try to do these yourself. It's kind of like these Pinterest fails where you try out Pinterest ideas and they look terrible the first time, but by the 10th time, it looks way better. You can either do them yourselves or you can hire someone who is an industrial designer or mechanical engineer to actually prototype for you. Now, if you want to do something that involves electronics, for example, or engineering components, I would suggest you do want to hire someone that has the right background for it. But in terms of actually just doing like look-alike models out of foam, I would say, just get your hands wet. And I would encourage everyone to be involved in that process, because a lot of times the best way to communicate your ideas through something 3D. And if you come up with an idea, the only way to really prototype that idea properly is either you prototyping it yourself or giving someone else enough details and walking them through that process for them to get to a final sort of 3D model that's similar enough to what you have in mind. So I would encourage people to just get their hands wet. By the 10th time, it will definitely look better than first.
Great, and a follow-up question to that is about, still on the subject of prototyping, you mentioned that, hire somebody to help you with that. If somebody's working on a startup, there's very little financial support there. So what do you do in that process?
The hiring process or like team process is something that I haven't really gone to for this presentation, mainly because it's out of the scope. But I would say that any startup starts out with people working for free, and a lot of times it's really getting people to really believe in your idea and believe in your cause enough to actually join you. And it's very, very likely that if you do hire a designer, it's not a one-time thing that they're done with once they finish the prototypes. They're likely going to stay with you for the long run and really help you throughout the entire process from phase 1 all the way to phase 5. So you're really looking at a person that should be a part of the team for the long run, not just someone that's there for 2 weeks just to help you prototype. So if you don't have that type of person on your team, I would suggest that it is important to have a person like that on the team no matter what. So do factor that into your team process.
So that really speaks to the complementary skill sets required in terms of forming your own startup team.
Absolutely.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Ricardo's asking, what do you think about the theory that sometimes users don't really know what they want? Like Henry Ford said, if I ask people what they want, they would say a faster horse. How do you address that?
I think part of this is where, first of all, quantity comes in. If you interview 10 people and they don't tell you what they want, by the time you get to 100, you get to know a little better. So quantity matters in that case. And secondly, this is where I was talking about this whole observational research and then day in the life of kind of research. And then what you can also do is become one of the users. So for example, I work with a lot of people who are blind, and a lot of us, what we do is actually blindfold ourselves for, say, a week, and then just go around and try and live our daily life. Now that's extremely hard, obviously, but you get to pick up a lot of things that you wouldn't normally pick up by even observing the user. So become one of the users. And see what that's like. Now, I'm not suggesting, I don't know if you work with people in wheelchairs to actually chop off your legs, but do as much as you can within reason to actually get as close to the problem and to the user as possible.
Absolutely. And Yuanpo was asking, based on your experience in practice, what is the most critical principle for each of the 5 elements in the design process that you've shown?
The most critical, that's a tough one. So for empathy, I would say, so is he asking out of the different numbers I put down, which is the most important?
Yeah, so I think what he's really getting to is, you know, in each of those 5, what do you call this? The hexagonal shapes, the element that you've kind of brought up. Are there critical elements in each? What is the most critical principle, if you will, or the defining thing for each stage that you just have to pay attention to as a takeaway?
Gotcha. Okay, so for the 5, the first one, empathize, I would say just really get to know your user. These are just the different methodologies for getting to know your user. I would say at the bare minimum, at least do in-person interviews. If you can't get to the other ones, at least do in-person interviews and look at the existing solutions. For phase 2, and obviously document everything. For phase 2, define. I would say, this is tough.
I think the specificity is quite important here, right? Like it's really defining, narrowing down.
Yeah, I really don't think you should skip any part of this for all 3. I would say go through all of them for this one. Because you're really trying to clarify what the problem is with all your interviews and all your maybe even surveys added all together. You're really trying to figure out what the problem is. So here is just you trying to figure out, clarify the problem, and actually categorize and really getting to the bottom of it. For ideate, here you're just really trying to come up with as many ideas as possible, and then narrowing it down to the best idea possible. So that's.
I can pause there for a second. How do you, a lot of us have the issue of generating mass quantities of ideas because we think about potential opportunities, but then, or brainstorm for these ideas, but then at the same time, we're evaluating equally at the same time. What is in your practical exercises that you've done, stop the evaluation or interrupt the evaluation process and put that aside? Can you share that?
So there are multiple ways of doing brainstorming. A lot of different companies recommend different methods. One method that people like to do is to actually brainstorm individually first and just write down whatever comes to mind without thinking twice about it. And then by the end of, say, 30 minutes, you have a whole list of different ideas. Then you can start sharing ideas you really like with the group and then brainstorming together. That's one methodology. The second one is to do so in a group setting, but just not judging each other's ideas. But again, you start to see a lot of group thinking happening in this case. I mean, again, there are many, many different ways of brainstorming. Some people also like to do like word scrambles where they have a lot of just random words that they either cut out, or their products that also feature these, where they would just put in a box, mix them together, and then just pull out random words and see how that would affect their brainstorming process. And you get all kinds of really crazy ideas. Most of them score very, very low on the functionality or even feasibility aspects. But at least this is how you generate very, very out-of-box ideas, because a lot of times, you know, it's very easy to modify existing product, but to come up with something new is very, very different. The other thing you can do is just really, really focus in on the user needs and look at what are some of the practical solutions involving each of the user needs and whether you can combine that together. So that's another approach that you can do. So to go on with the other phases, for phase 4 prototyping, again, this is split up into physical versus software. And with these, you're really just looking at building something, building as many things as you possibly can, and then testing to see if these actually work. So I would say the main takeaway here is to just get your hands wet, get your hands dirty, and just build and then test. And then for testing, here, the bare minimum I would say is at least get feedback from users for your prototypes.
Great, thank you, Jin.
Yep.
This has been very informative. And we just want to thank you again for your time in this regard. For the rest of our users, we hope you had a good time and it's been an informative, inspirational, and a great time of learning. We have another e-seminar coming up August 22nd. If you haven't already signed up, we highly encourage you to sign up for that. Until the next one, we will see you soon. Bye now.
Yeah, and just one more thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if I got to all the questions. Thank you for moderating the questions, but if you do have additional questions, or if I somehow haven't answered your question, feel free to email me. My email is at the bottom here. And that's all I have to say. Thank you, guys.